Hi everyone, it's Marianne and welcome to my Wasteless Life. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I propagate my plants. Thank you so much for joining me today, and for new, this is my Wasteless Life where I take you along my plant and sustainable lifestyle journey and share with you some of my tips and tricks along the way. So this is actually the first episode of my propagation series. So I hope to come up with videos at least once a month for my propagation series, and I will share with you different techniques and mediums of propagating plants, from beginner friendly ones to a little bit more advanced propagating techniques. So I'm very excited about this video because a lot of people are very interested in propagating plants, especially now as we head into the growing season. It is the best time to start propagating your plants so that they'll be ready come spring or summer for you to either give them away or sell, or just add more to your plant collection, whatever you want to do with them. So for the very first episode of my propagation series, we're gonna do propagations using soilless mediums. So if you've been with me for a while, you've seen me do soilless propagations in many different videos. Me personally, I do prefer propagating more in soilless media as opposed to propagating in water. I just have a lot more success with it, and the transition from the soilless media to actual soil, the transplant shock is a lot less as opposed to propagating plants in water and then shifting them or transplanting them into soil, which I had a lot of failures doing that in the past. I would successfully propagate the plant in water, but when I transfer them to soil, they die out. So yeah, let me share with you the different mediums and methods on how to propagate plants in soilless mediums or media.
So this is the Peperomia of the Folia variegata. I had this one for quite some time, and as you can see, it has grown really tall and lanky. It can't really hold itself up without a support. Regardless of the medium that I use, the process is very straightforward, so I'm going to be focusing more on the tips and tricks as well as the pros and cons of using each of the medium that I'll be sharing with you today. And for this plant, I'm just cutting it off below a node where I want it to, and I'm going to remove some of the leaves to expose the nodes. And I'll be propagating this using sphagnum moss, which I already have some soaking in a bowl of water that is mixed with the root and grow solution. One tip that was actually shared by one of you is to first put LECA at the bottom of the nursery pot. The LECA would help to keep the sphagnum moss evenly moist, as it will help wick up moisture up to the sphagnum moss when it gets dry, so the sphagnum moss is constantly moist without getting too wet but also never getting too dry. I am squeezing out as much water as I can before wrapping it around the cutting. You would want the sphagnum moss to be just damp and not overly saturated. That way you can prevent rotting of the propagation before it starts to root. And with the way that I'm also wrapping it around the stem or the nodes, is I'm wrapping it very loosely so that there's room for aeration and for the roots to grow. The sphagnum moss can retain a lot of moisture for a lot longer period of time. So for those who have failed propagating sphagnum moss, the likely culprit is overwatering or oversaturating the moss. The more popular or common way using sphagnum moss for propagation is in prop boxes, and usually it's plastic containers used for propagation. And I have some Syndaptus spectus argyrius cuttings here that I'll be propagating inside this prop box. And what I love about this upcycled plastic container that used to hold strawberries is that it has holes in it. Some people like tightly sealed plastic containers as their pot boxes. I don't. I do think the holes are very necessary for aeration, and while you want that condensation to form in your pot boxes, it can also cause rotting. So it's important to always keep the aeration there, and it will still provide a lot of humidity for your plants because the lid will be closed but the holes will provide aeration. And as you can see, I squeeze out as much of water as I can from the moss, and here I'm fluffing the moss because I don't want it to be overly compact so that the roots have spaces to grow. And again, for aeration, and the holes also underneath makes it easier for me to bottom water the sphagnum moss without having to water it from the top, which also can cause rotting or damage to the leaves. And when propagating in prop boxes, I don't feel the need to wrap the sphagnum moss around the cutting. I just put it on top of the sphagnum moss, just making sure that the node part is facing down and touching the sphagnum moss. And this container also allows me to bottom water since it has slits at the bottom, and that way it also encourages the roots to grow downwards in search of the water. With single leaf cuttings, there's a good chance that not all of them would root, so it's good to have multiples of them. And also by laying it just on top of the sphagnum moss and not wrapping it around, it would also prevent premature rotting of the cuttings. When it comes to propagating, I find that temperature is a little bit more important than lighting. Make sure you put your propagations on top of a heat mat if you have them, or just somewhere that it is not cold, like a windowsill, especially during winter time. So I would make sure it gets a little bit of a higher temperature, around 65 degrees and up, because that's when the roots would start forming. Any colder than that, the roots will not get triggered to grow. Lighting, of course, is still important. You don't want to put this in the dark. You would still want to give it enough light naturally or artificially, but as mentioned, the temperature does take a little bit more importance than the lighting. And when it comes to watering, propagations do need a little bit more water than our regular plants. But as mentioned earlier, when propagating in sphagnum moss, you don't want it to be overly saturated. You just want to keep it evenly moist. And with this setup, I could bottom water the sphagnum moss so that it gets just enough water it needs and I don't have to top water it, which could lead to the rotting of the cuttings. Another soilless medium that I love to use is Perlite, and I'm going to use it with this Hoya carrii. It has some roots, but I think it will do a lot better in Perlite. And Perlite is pretty straightforward. It's a growing medium. Fill up your nursery pot with it, moisten the Perlite, and then stick the cuttings into it. With Perlite, however, I prefer using it for cuttings that are a little bit more sturdier and don't require a lot of watering, kind of like with this Hoya. Using this medium works best with more succulent type of propagations, and it will do a lot better when it comes to prevent rotting.
Let me show you the plants that I have successfully propagated in each of the Soilless medium, starting with this one, which is my Syndapsus pictus argyrius that I have successfully propagated in LECA. With LECA, it's a hit or miss for me. I have successes with my POTHOS and my Monstera cuttings, but not for all of them. I only have a success when it comes to Monstera is with my Monstera deliciosa. When it comes to Monstera sultipicana, I experienced multiple root rots with that one in LECA until the plant eventually died. And I also experienced root rot with my Tridescantia Nanook when I initially was propagating it in water, and then I transferred it into LECA and the roots just rotted out, so I took it out of LECA. So for me personally, LECA is a hit or miss. I definitely don't recommend it for beginners as something that they should start with, or if you want to experiment with propagating in LECA, then start with a plant that you don't mind losing or you have a lot of. So even if your initial cuttings that you propagate in LECA doesn't work out, you still have more of that plant. Because I did that initially for the plants that I imported from Thailand, I thought propagating them in LECA or rehabbing them in LECA would be the best choice for them, but most of them suffered root rot within a week or two. And if I didn't do that, I would probably have saved a lot more of my plants, especially with the Syndapsus trubii and also with my Thai constellation Monstera. And so the other one is this Monstera deliciosa, a juvenile one. And I also have another one which is a more mature Monstera deliciosa, which is this one. As you can see how much roots it has grown already, and much of this root growth happened while it was in LECA. It hasn't pushed out new growth yet, but it's about to. I don't know if you can see right over here. It's starting to push out that new growth. So I'm excited for this one. Another successful propagation in LECA that really surprised me was the Peperomia prestata or string of turtles. So basically this is a planter that don't have any drainage holes at the bottom. I just filled it up with LECA, filled it with water, I think halfway. And anytime a vine or leaf drop from the mother plant, I just stick it up here and see if it will propagate or not. And so far, most of it has been propagating and it has been growing pretty well. So this one is one of my surprise success in propagating in LECA, my Peperomia prostrata, string of turtles in a turtle planter. The ones I'll show you are the plants that I successfully propagated or currently propagating in sphagnum moss And the first one is my Rhaphidophora tetrasperma. In the video Plant Trends I Hate, I mentioned that my Rhaphidophora tetrasperma suffered root rot because the roots were suffocated in a net pot that I didn't know about that it was planted in. So this one is about a month or two later. As you can see, it's very healthy. I put it in sphagnum moss. And I also have another Rhaphidophora tetrasperma that is suffering from root rot, which I have transferred in sphagnum moss after I clean out and basically chop off all of its root. And this is that plant. As you can see, the leaves has not perked up yet, unlike with this one, but you can also see that there's no yellowing. All of the leaves have been preserved, so the rotting has definitely stopped, and I'm pretty sure some of the roots have started to grow, but I haven't really checked yet. But yeah, so I'm pretty sure in a month or so this will also gonna start looking like this, so I'm very excited about that. And another plant that I successfully propagated in sphagnum moss is my Scindapsus jade satin. I originally got this from a trade with a lot more leaves, but a lot of them rotted off because the Scindapsus pictus jade satin is a lot more prone to root rot compared to most Scindapsus plants. But I thought it was just going to be like any other Scindapsus pictus, but it's not. But I placed it in sphagnum moss and it has grown 1, 2, 3 new leaves. It has one incoming here and another incoming here. So this is also another one of my successes in propagating sphagnum moss. And last and certainly not the least is my Phi constellation Monstera. So this one has been on quite of a journey. It did arrive to me with a little bit of root rot, but not only did it suffer root rot, all of the leaves except one, which is this one, all rotted off. So it was a real challenge reviving this plant from initially having it in LECA and then putting it in water and eventually putting it in sphagnum moss. And I truly believe it is the sphagnum moss that saved this plant, because those two other propagation methods nearly killed this plant. The sphagnum moss saved it. And it has a very strong aerial root coming out from here, and as you can see, I'm not letting it grow into the sphagnum moss because I am going to show you another propagation method using this aerial root, and I'm pretty sure some of you can already guess what type of propagation method that I am referring to. When it comes to successfully propagating in perlite, to show you one that I already have thriving is this variegated string of hearts. So this one is mostly growing in perlite. I'm pretty sure there's a little bit of sand already at the bottom. Yeah, there's sand at the bottom, but I believe the top half of this is purely perlite because that's where I initially started growing the string of hearts. So one of the downsides in propagating in perlite is the perlite either grows moss or algae very easily, or it could turn brown like this. I might add this as a bonus, but propagating plants in orchid bark, but this one is a little bit of common sense. This is orchid, I use orchid bark on it. But with this one, because this orchid was a rescue plant, I initially tried growing or propagating or rehabbing this orchid in LECA. That also didn't work out for this one. It was rotting quite a bit often before I switched it to actual orchid bark. And now that it was in orchid bark, I did add a little bit of moss in it as well, so it's not purely orchid bark, and it's been doing pretty well. As you can see, it has started to bloom flowers. This is the first one that bloomed, and there's another one here, and I have another one incoming right over here, and another bud is starting to form. So orchid bark is a good medium to propagate your plants in for epiphytic plants or for plants that you know already don't grow in soil. But as a caveat to that, if you are propagating in orchid bark, you would still want the propagation to already have grown some roots. It doesn't have to be very significant, but it has to have grown some roots before you put it into orchid bark. I would start propagating it in sphagnum moss or perlite first before I transfer it into orchid bark. And that's it for today's propagation video. If you like it, please give me a thumbs up. And if you're new here, I hope you subscribe. I come up with houseplants and sustainable lifestyle videos every week. And if you haven't yet, go check out these videos out here until my next one. But until then, I see you. I appreciate you. Take care of yourself and each other, and have a plentiful day. Bye.